Every American president has a love story, and some of them are sweet, dramatic, shocking, or straight up unbelievable. From chance meetings at dances and classrooms, to introductions by cousins, neighbors, and even political rivals, this is the complete story of how every U.S. president met his wife. Let's go in order, from George Washington, all the way to Joe Biden. George Washington and Martha Custis. George Washington first met Martha during the social season in Williamsburg. Some say they were introduced by a mutual friend, Colonel Chamberlain, when both stayed overnight at his home in May 1758. John Adams and Abigail Smith. Abigail was 15 years old when she met John Adams in 1759. John visited her home with his friend Richard Cranch, who was engaged to Abigail's sister Mary. Thomas Jefferson and Martha Wayles Skelton. Martha first married Bathurst Skelton in 1766, but he died in 1768. Jefferson was her third cousin and began courting her in December 1770. James Madison and Dolly Payne Todd. Widowed Dolly was introduced to Madison by Aaron Burr, a close friend of Madison's, in May 1794. Madison was 43, a lifelong bachelor, and 17 years older than Dolly. James Monroe and Elizabeth Courtwright. Monroe met Elizabeth in 1785 while in New York for the Continental Congress. He first saw her at a theater. It's said that Elizabeth and her sisters looked so beautiful at the theater that all the men left their seats to look at them. John Quincy Adams and Louisa Catherine Johnson. Louisa's father became the American consul in London in 1790. The family entertained many guests, and John Quincy Adams was one of them. At first, the family thought he liked Louisa's sister Nancy, but they later realized he was interested in Louisa. Andrew Jackson and Rachel Donaldson. When Andrew Jackson migrated to Nashville, Tennessee, in 1788, he boarded with Rachel's mother. The two became close and got married shortly after. Martin Van Buren and Hannah Hose. Martin Van Buren married his childhood friend and cousin, Hannah, in 1807, when she was 23 and he was 24. William Henry Harrison and Anna Sims Harrison. Anna met Harrison when she visited her sister in Lexington, Kentucky. Her father did not approve of Harrison because of his military career, but Anna and Harrison continued seeing each other. They eventually eloped. John Tyler and Letitia Christian Tyler. The Christian and Tyler families already knew each other. Letitia met John Tyler during a visit in 1808, and he began courting her. They had 8 children together. Letitia died of a stroke in the White House in September 1842. John Tyler and Julia Gardner Tyler. Julia first met President Tyler at a White House reception in 1842. He flirted openly, even chasing her around a table during a card game. At 22, she repeatedly rejected him, largely because he was 30 years older, but eventually agreed to marry him. James K. Polk and Sarah Childress Polk. Sarah met Polk while they were both students in Murfreesboro. He was 19, she was 12. They were formally introduced in the early 1820s when Polk joined the state legislature. Andrew Jackson encouraged Polk to marry her, calling Sarah wealthy, pretty, ambitious, and intelligent. Zachary Taylor and Margaret Smith Taylor. She met Lieutenant Zachary Taylor while visiting her sister in Kentucky in 1809, and after a 7-month-long courtship, she married him on June 21, 1810. Millard Fillmore and Abigail Powers Fillmore. Abigail was Fillmore's first wife. She met Fillmore while teaching at New Hope Academy. She was even his teacher. Millard Fillmore and Caroline Carmichael Fillmore. Caroline and Fillmore met through their social circles. Franklin Pierce and Jane Appleton. There are several versions of how they met. One says Pierce warned her not to sit under a tree during a thunderstorm. Another says her brother-in-law introduced them. And another says Pierce met her while visiting her mother's home. Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd. Mary met Lincoln at her sister Elizabeth Edwards' home. They connected quickly because both loved politics. Andrew Johnson and Eliza McCardle. Eliza first saw Andrew Johnson in 1826 when she visited his tailor shop. Ulysses S. Grant and Julia Dent. Grant was a college mate of her brother, Fred. Grant began visiting the Dent home in 1844, and they began courting. Rutherford B. Hayes and Lucy Webb. Lucy first met Hayes at Ohio Wesleyan University when she was 14 and he was 23. Years later, in 1850, they met again at a wedding when Lucy was 19. James Garfield and Lucretia Rudolph. Lucretia studied at the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, co-founded by her father. Garfield studied and taught there too, and he became one of her teachers. Chester A. Arthur and Ellen Herndon Arthur. They met in 1856 through her cousin Dabney Herndon Morey, who was a friend of Arthur's. Grover Cleveland and Frances Folsom. Frances first met Cleveland as an infant. He was a close friend of her father and later became executor of her father's estate. He helped support Frances and her mother. After she graduated from Wells College, she married Cleveland while he was president. Benjamin Harrison and Caroline Scott. Caroline met Harrison when he was a student of her father at Farmers College. William McKinley and Ida Saxton. Ida first met McKinley at a picnic at Myers Lake, Ohio, in 1868 while he was visiting his sister. But she was already engaged to another. Ida's fiancé died suddenly while she was in Europe, and after she returned, McKinley impressed her at a lecture, leading to their courtship. Theodore Roosevelt and Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt. Alice met Theodore Roosevelt on October 18, 1878, at the home of her relatives and next-door neighbors, the Saltonstalls. Roosevelt also knew her cousin, Richard Saltonstall, from Harvard. Theodore Roosevelt and Edith Caro Roosevelt. The Roosevelt and Caro families were close. Edith grew up near the Roosevelts and even attended school in their home. They developed feelings as teenagers but fell out. After his first wife died, Theodore saw Edith again by chance at his sister's home. They secretly got engaged soon after. William Howard Taft and Helen Herron Taft. Helen met Taft at a sledding party in 1880. Their families already knew each other. Later, Helen started an intellectual discussion group and invited Taft and his brother. Taft began courting her with letters, flowers, and visits to dances. Woodrow Wilson and Ellen Axon Wilson. Wilson met Ellen in April 1883 during a visit to his cousin in Rome, Georgia. She was keeping house for her widowed father. Woodrow Wilson and Edith Balling Galt Wilson. In March 1915, recently widowed Edith Galt was introduced to the recently widowed President Wilson at the White House. The introduction was arranged by Wilson's cousin and White House hostess, Helen Bones. Warren G. Harding and Florence Kling Harding. Florence was a piano teacher and a divorcee when she met Warren Harding. She met him through his sister Charity, who was one of Florence's students. Calvin Coolidge and Grace Goodhue Coolidge. Grace first saw Calvin Coolidge while she was watering flowers outside her dormitory at Northampton. He was standing in a window across from her, shaving while wearing only long underwear and a derby hat. She laughed, he heard it, and asked his landlord to introduce them. They were later formally introduced when both were invited to a mutual friend's house. Herbert Hoover and Lou Henry Hoover. Lou attended a geology lecture at Stanford, became interested in the subject, and joined the Franklin D. Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor met Franklin, her father's fifth cousin, on a train to Tivoli, New York, in 1902. They began a secret romance and got engaged in 1903. Harry S. Truman and Bess Wallace Truman. Harry and Bess went to school together. Years later, Harry used the excuse of returning a cake plate to talk to her again, and they began courting. Dwight D. Eisenhower and Mamie Dowd Eisenhower. Mamie had many admirers, but she met Eisenhower in 1915 at Fort Sam Houston while her family was visiting friends. He broke military tradition by giving her a personal tour. Mamie turned him down at first, but he kept pursuing her. They got engaged on Valentine's Day 1916. John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy. They met in May 1952 at a dinner party hosted by journalist Charles Bartlett. They shared interests in reading, writing, Catholicism, and travel. JFK proposed after winning his Senate election. Lyndon B. Johnson and Claudia Lady Bird Johnson. A mutual friend in Austin introduced Lady Bird to Lyndon when he was a young congressional aide. He proposed on their first date at the Driscoll Hotel. She said no at first, but he continued asking. She accepted 10 weeks later. Richard Nixon and Thelma Pat Ryan Nixon. Pat met Nixon when they were both cast in the Little Theater play The Dark Tower. He asked her to marry him on their very first date. Gerald Ford and Betty Bloomer Ford. Mutual friends introduced them in August 1947. Ford had returned from Navy service and was beginning his legal career and planning to run for Congress. Jimmy Carter and Rosalind Smith Carter. They grew up as neighbors. Rosalind was close friends with Jimmy's sister Ruth. Ronald Reagan and Jane Wyman. Reagan met his first wife, Jane Wyman, while filming Brother Rat in 1938. Ronald Reagan and Nancy Davis Reagan. Nancy met Reagan in 1949 when she asked him for help clearing her name from a mistaken Hollywood blacklist. He was president of the Screen Actors Guild at the time. George H. W. Bush and Barbara Pierce Bush. George met Barbara when she was 16 at a Christmas dance. He saw her across the room and asked a friend to introduce them. They instantly liked each other. Bill Clinton and Hillary Rodham Clinton. They met in 1971 at Yale Law School. The first time they officially spoke was in the library. George W. Bush and Laura Welch Bush. Bush met Laura in July 1977 when mutual friends invited them both to a backyard barbecue. Barack Obama and Michelle Obama. Michelle met Barack at the law firm Sidley Austin LLP, where she was assigned to mentor him while he worked there as a summer associate. Donald and Ivana Trump. Ivana was in New York with a group of models in 1976 when she met Donald Trump. Donald and Marla Trump. Donald Trump met his second wife, Marla Maples, at a tennis match in 1985. Donald Trump and Melania Trump. Melania met Trump in September 1998 at a party through a mutual friend, Paolo Zampalli. Joe Biden and Jill Biden. Jill met Joe Biden in March 1975 on a blind date arranged by Joe's brother Frank, who knew Jill from college. Joe had already seen a picture of her in an advertisement.